Officer Carlos Martinez had always been proud of his work. He believed in justice and serving the community, but as the years went on, he had started to develop certain assumptions about the people he encountered each day when he was on patrol. His experiences had led him to believe that some people were more likely to cause trouble than others, especially when they didn't fit the image of the law-abiding citizens he had come to expect. For some reason, Martinez often found himself drawn to certain areas of town where he would regularly stop and question individuals he felt were acting suspicious or out of place, despite no clear evidence to support his instincts. It was on one of these routine patrols that he first saw her, Sierra Johnson, a black woman in her early 30s, driving a sleek high-end car down a quiet street in a neighborhood known for its lower-income residents. Martinez's first thought was that it was strange to see someone driving such a car in this part of town. It didn't make sense in his mind. It felt like an outlier, and with that feeling of unease, he decided to make a move. His hand hovered over the radio before pressing it to request backup before getting out of the car to approach hers. Sierra had been having a long day at work as a state lawyer representing people who had often been wronged by the system. She had dealt with complex cases and harsh realities all day and was ready to go home. She didn't think twice. When the police lights flashed behind her, it was just another routine stop that she had become used to over the years. As a woman of color, she had been stopped by the police numerous times before, and though she wasn't looking forward to the encounter, she knew how to handle it. With calmness and respect, she pulled over to the side of the road and waited for the officer to approach. Martinez walked toward the car with a slow, purposeful stride, sizing up the woman inside. She didn't appear to be nervous or afraid, which in his mind only made her seem more suspicious. There was a level of confidence in her demeanor that made him uncomfortable. He had seen it before in people who thought they were untouchable or above the law. Without even speaking to her, he made up his mind that this was going to be a stop to remember. He tapped on her window and gestured for her to roll it down. Sierra did so with a quiet grace. Martinez asked for her license and registration in a tone that was more demanding than polite. Sierra replied smoothly with a friendly but reserved voice. Here we go again, she thought, but remained composed. Handing over her documents without hesitation, he took them and glanced at them briefly, but his mind was already racing, trying to find something to challenge her on, something that would justify his gut feeling that this was not just another ordinary stop. He began asking her questions that weren't really necessary, like where she was going, what she was doing out here at this time of night. Despite her calm and clear responses, Martinez felt the need to dig deeper. He asked her to step out of the car, and as he did, a small knot of tension began to form in the air between them. Sierra's patience began to wear thin, but she maintained her dignity, knowing that any sign of frustration might escalate the situation. She had been in enough tense situations to know that. The air between them grew heavier as Martinez asked Sierra to step out of the car. His voice was firm, but not aggressive, but his eyes were sharp and watchful. Sierra glanced at him, carefully keeping her expression neutral. She knew the moment she stepped out, things could spiral quickly, but she also knew she hadn't done anything wrong. Still, she followed his command, stepping out of the car with a quiet grace, her movements slow, deliberate, as she closed the door behind her. Martinez circled around her, looking her up and down, his eyes scanning every inch of her, from head to toe. Sierra stood tall, her back straight, a slight breeze lifting the edges of her jacket, but she kept her hands visible by her sides, just in case he thought she was reaching for something. He couldn't see her face, but she could feel the tension rising in the way he stared at her. There was something off about the situation. His eyes were filled with something more than just routine police suspicion. He asked her why she was in this part of town late at night. The question was casual, but his tone was anything but friendly. Sierra paused for a moment, unsure of how to respond. She had heard similar questions before in situations like this, and every time she had responded in the same way, clear, precise, yet always met with more suspicion. It wasn't the question itself that bothered her, it was the assumption behind it, as if she needed to justify her presence there, as if she wasn't allowed to exist in a place that wasn't the image people expected of her. "I'm just heading home," she said, keeping her voice steady. She made sure to keep her hands where he could see them, but something in her calm response seemed to irk him. He tilted his head slightly, his gaze lingering a little too long. He asked her again to step aside, And when she did, he started talking about searching her vehicle. Something about the way he mentioned it made her feel even more uncomfortable. She had been through this routine too many times before she could tell when an officer was pushing the boundaries. Sierra took a deep breath, but her heart was racing inside. Even though she kept her cool, she felt a tightness in her chest. She knew exactly what was going on. It wasn't about a broken taillight or a minor infraction. It was about her being in a place where she didn't belong in his mind, or rather where he thought she didn't belong. She'd been stopped before for less. And she could tell this wasn't going to be an ordinary encounter. She could feel the weight of his eyes watching her. Every move, the slight unease in his posture that betrayed the authority he was trying to wield over her. She calmly refused his request to search her car, citing that she hadn't broken any laws and that he had no reason to search her vehicle. She knew her rights. She wasn't about to let him push her around just because of some assumption in his head about who she was or where she was from. Martinez paused for a moment, looking at her with disbelief. Her refusal seemed to catch him off guard, but only for a second before he stepped forward. Again, his eyes narrowing this time, his voice took on a sharper edge. "You're being difficult," he said, his tone more insistent. And with that, the moment shifted. He reached for his radio and called for backup. Sierra's eyes flickered for a brief second. She remained calm, but her mind was racing. She knew what was coming next. She had seen this play out so many times before. But the feeling of being treated like a suspect for no reason felt like a familiar sting, a reality she had come to know all too well. Martinez felt the familiar rush of adrenaline as he called for backup, his mind racing. As he tried to make sense of the situation, he wasn't sure what had gone wrong. He had simply asked a few questions. And then when she refused to cooperate, something inside him snapped. He couldn't let it go. Not now, not when he was this far into the stop. He had already committed to this course of action, and he wasn't about to back down just because she wouldn't give him what he wanted. Sierra stood still, her arms crossed, as she waited for the backup to arrive. Her gaze never left him, her expression calm, but her eyes hardening ever so slightly as she realized the path this was taking. She had seen enough in her career to know when an officer's pride was on the line, and she could tell that was what was happening here. Martinez wasn't trying to protect the public or maintain order anymore. This was about him proving that he was in control. But Sierra wasn't going to let herself become another statistic, a part of a broken system. She refused to give in. When the other officers arrived, Martinez turned to them, quickly giving a quick explanation of the situation. One officer approached Sierra, asking her to step aside while the other began talking to Martinez, trying to understand the situation better. Sierra felt her stomach twist as she was momentarily separated from the officer she had been speaking with. Even though she was surrounded by police, the feeling of being isolated in that moment hit her hard. She had been in situations like this before, but each time it never got any easier. Her mind was focused now, though she had to think quickly. She knew that if this situation escalated, it could go from bad to worse. She had already been through enough fights in her career, fighting for justice and fighting against unfair treatment. But this time it was different. This time it was happening to her, and she couldn't help but feel a pang of anger rise up inside of her. How could this be happening? How could a simple drive home turn into a nightmare just because of someone's assumptions about who she was? Martinez came back to her, now his face hard, his words sharper than before. He told her she was being placed under arrest for resisting arrest and disturbing the peace. The charges seemed absurd to Sierra, and she immediately knew they were being used as a justification to cover up the fact that he had been wrong from the start. Still, she kept her composure. Even as she felt the cuffs being placed on her wrists, she knew that getting upset would only make things worse, so she remained silent. As she was led toward the police car, Martinez tried to explain himself, but his words were barely audible over the pounding in his chest. He couldn't believe what he was doing. Why had he let this get so out of control? He was supposed to be serving the community, not causing more harm. But as Sierra was pushed into the back of the patrol car, he couldn't shake the feeling of guilt and unease that had begun to settle in the pit of his stomach. Sierra sat in the back of the car, staring out of the window, her hands still restrained by the cuffs. She tried to calm her racing thoughts. She knew that no matter how wrong this was, no matter how unjust it felt, it wasn't over. Not yet. She wasn't about to let one officer's mistake ruin everything she had worked for. She had too much at stake to back down now. She would fight this, she had to. Back at the precinct, the air was thick with tension as Officer Martinez stood by the desk, his mind racing with confusion and guilt. Sierra was placed in a holding cell for the time being while the paperwork was processed, and despite the external calmness she projected, Martinez could sense that something wasn't right as he watched her walk away. His thoughts were a whirlwind. How had he gotten here? How had this ordinary traffic stop spiraled so far out of control? It was then that Martinez's colleague, Officer Ryan, approached him, glancing at the screen in front of him. As he typed something into the computer, Martinez turned his attention toward him, trying to act casual, but his unease was evident. Ryan didn't seem to notice at first until he saw the file that popped up on the screen. The officer paused, staring at it for a moment, his eyebrows raising as he did so. He glanced back at Martinez, his voice low and hesitant. "You know who she is, don't you?" Martinez blinked for a moment, confused, before replying, "No, why would I know her?" Ryan didn't respond immediately, his eyes still locked on the screen. He shook his head slowly, looking at the officer in disbelief. He muttered under his breath, then added, "You've just arrested Sierra Johnson, one of the top lawyers in the state." The name hit Martinez like a slap to the face. He felt his stomach drop as the realization set in. He had just arrested one of the most respected attorneys in the state, and he had no idea who she was, not until now. The weight of the mistake bore down on him like a ton of bricks. He had been so focused on his assumptions that he hadn't even bothered to check her name or credentials until it was too late. Ryan continued to stare at the screen, his voice a mix of surprise and concern. "You know, she represents clients against police misconduct, right? She's been involved in some pretty high-profile cases. You've really messed up here." Martinez's mind began to swirl with regret as he pieced it all together. The way he had treated Sierra, the way he had let his prejudices cloud his judgment, the arrogance that had led him to escalate the situation without ever questioning his own motives. He tried to rationalize it in his head. Maybe he had been just doing his job, maybe it was just a misunderstanding, but deep down he knew it wasn't that simple. Ryan glanced at him one last time before walking away, leaving Martinez to wrestle with the reality of his actions. Sierra wasn't just some random driver. She wasn't someone to be dismissed or treated like a criminal based on assumptions and stereotypes. Sierra Johnson was a person with power, influence, and a voice that carried weight. She wasn't the kind of person who would let this slide. Martinez paced back and forth in the hallway, trying to process what had just happened. But the more he thought about it, the more he realized the depth of his mistake. It wasn't just a small error in judgment, it was a moment that could cost him his career. And even more than that, it was a moment that exposed a flaw in the very system. He was a part of a flaw he had ignored for too long. Meanwhile, Sierra sat in the holding cell, her mind cleared despite the chaotic emotions swirling around her. She had been through enough battles to know this wasn't the end. She would fight. She would make sure the world knew what had happened, and she would make sure that nothing like this happened again to anyone else. Next morning, the news spread faster than Martinez could have imagined. Sierra's arrest had become a headline, a story that quickly caught the attention of the public and the media. The details were still sparse, but the outrage was immediate. The initial shock from the public was one of disbelief, followed by anger. How could a respected lawyer be treated like a criminal for no reason at all? The social media posts came pouring in with hashtags calling for justice and demanding accountability for the officer who had made such a grave mistake. Sierra's name was on everyone's lips. Her reputation as a fighter for justice and equality preceded her, and now her arrest was fueling the fire for reform. The media outlets couldn't get enough of the story, and soon news vans began gathering outside the precinct as journalists clamored for answers from the police department. They wanted to know how something like this could happen, how an officer could mistake a professional like Sierra for someone who posed a threat simply because of her appearance and her presence in a certain neighborhood. Sierra's colleagues of the law firm rallied behind her with unwavering support. They knew exactly who she was, and they were all too familiar with the uphill battles she fought every day against systemic injustice. The lawyers she worked alongside spoke out fiercely in her defense, and within hours calls were being made to hold the police accountable, to investigate what had transpired and ensure that this kind of mistake would never happen again. For Sierra, the anger she felt was tempered by a calm resolve. She had been in the courtroom too many times to be rattled by the attention now on her. She knew this would be an important case, but it wasn't just about the headlines. It wasn't just about the public outcry. It was about something bigger. It was about standing up against an unjust system that allowed people to be wrongfully targeted and treated as criminals based on nothing more than their race and their status. She gave a statement to the press later that day, her voice steady and clear. As she spoke to the cameras, she emphasized how important it was for people to take responsibility for their actions, especially those in positions of power. She talked about the need for reform within the police force and how incidents like hers weren't isolated cases. They were part of a larger pattern, a system that needed to change. But more than anything, she sent a message of resilience to anyone who had ever been unjustly targeted for who they were or where they came from. This won't be the last time I fight for what's right, she said, and I'll be damned if I let this go without making sure that something changes. As the day wore on, the pressure mounted on the police department to take action. Martinez's superiors convened an emergency meeting to discuss the incident and the fallout that was now sweeping through the city. They knew they couldn't ignore it. They knew that this was a tipping point, a moment that could define the future of the department for years to come. But as they discussed the details of what had happened, they couldn't shake the fact that this was no ordinary case. It wasn't just an arrest gone wrong. It was a stark reminder of the biases that still lurked within their ranks. And then there was Martinez himself. He had spent the day trying to avoid the conversations that were unfolding all around him. He could hear the whispers in the halls, the way his colleagues looked at him with a mixture of disbelief and pity. He knew they were waiting for him to explain himself, but he couldn't find the words. He didn't know how to justify what he had done. The shame he felt was unlike anything he had ever experienced. The pressure on Officer Martinez had become unbearable. As the days passed, he couldn't escape the whispers and the judgment from his fellow officers. It was as though he had become a pariah in the precinct. His actions had been put under a microscope, and now he was the subject of every conversation. Everyone had an opinion about what had happened and how things should have been handled better, but none of them could understand the way he felt in his chest. He couldn't help but replay every moment of that night over and over again, wondering where things had gone wrong and what he could have done differently, but deep down he knew the answer. He had let his assumptions take control. He had let his biases guide his actions, and the worst part was he had done it all without even realizing it. The truth was simple but painful. He had arrested Sierra Johnson because she didn't fit the image he expected of someone like her. He hadn't seen her for who she really was. He had only seen what he thought she should be, a threat to the order he had sworn to protect. Martinez found himself struggling with guilt and shame, his once unshakable confidence now replaced by doubt. He avoided looking anyone in the eye, and when his phone rang, he couldn't bring himself to answer it. He knew it was a call from his supervisor, or maybe a lawyer trying to figure out the next steps in this mess. But he couldn't face it, not yet. He had no idea how to begin to fix the situation, how to make it right. Meanwhile, Sierra's legal team was already hard at work, preparing for what was sure to be a battle that would go beyond the courtroom. They were not just going to let this incident slide. They were determined to make an example out of the arrest and hold the police department accountable. Sierra had made it clear that this was no longer just about her personal experience. It was about addressing the larger issue of police misconduct and racial profiling that plagued the system she had spent years fighting against. Sierra wasn't angry anymore, not in the way that people expected her to be. Her anger had been replaced with purpose. She knew that in order to create real change, she would need to stay calm, stay focused, and use her platform to bring attention to the issue. She had worked tirelessly to expose the injustices in the system, and now the world was listening. It wasn't just a matter of getting a few officers disciplined. It was about calling out the larger system that allowed this behavior to continue unchecked. Her statement had sparked a wave of support from civil rights groups, activists, and even other lawyers who had faced similar battles in their careers. They were all ready to stand beside her and fight for the change that was long overdue. The attention from the public only grew as the days passed, and soon calls for reform in the police force grew louder. People took to the streets to demand accountability. Protests erupted across the city with signs and chants calling for justice and an end to racial profiling. Martinez watched all of this unfold from his office, his mind racing as he saw the growing movement surrounding Sierra's case. He knew it wasn't going to end quietly. It wasn't just about one arrest anymore, it was about a larger reckoning that the country needed to face. And now he found himself at the center of it all, not as a hero, but as the symbol of everything that was wrong with the system. But as much as he wanted to hide from it, as much as he wanted to run away from the mess he had created, he knew he couldn't escape the consequences of his actions. He couldn't avoid the fact that he had hurt someone who didn't deserve it, and he couldn't ignore the fact that he was part of a much larger problem. The days turned into weeks, and as the public pressure mounted, so did the legal action. Sierra's legal team had filed a lawsuit against Officer Martinez and the police department on grounds of racial profiling, unlawful arrest, and violation of civil rights. The case was quickly gaining traction as more and more people began to see it as a test case for the broader issue of police misconduct. Sierra's name was now a rallying cry for justice and reform in a system that had long been broken. The media coverage continued to pour in with every twist and turn of the case. For Martinez, the isolation he had felt in the precinct was only growing worse. The whispers had turned into pointed questions and accusations. His colleagues were no longer treating him like one of them. He was the officer who had made the mistake, the officer whose actions had ignited a firestorm that none of them could ignore. It was a reality he couldn't escape. No matter how hard he tried, he had become the symbol of everything people were protesting against. And every day he walked through the precinct, he felt the weight of that shame pressing down on him harder and harder. But despite the overwhelming sense of guilt he carried, Martinez couldn't deny that a part of him was starting to question everything about his job, everything he thought he knew about justice and fairness. He had always believed that he was doing good, that he was helping to protect the community, but now he wasn't so sure anymore. The more he saw the protests and the public outcry, the more he realized that the system he had been a part of was deeply flawed, and the way he had treated Sierra was just one small example of the bigger picture. He began to ask himself what kind of officer he wanted to be. Did he want to continue down the path of unquestioning loyalty to the system, or did he want to face the uncomfortable truth that he had been part of a system that routinely oppressed people like Sierra and so many others? He wasn't sure what the answer was. But what he did know was that he couldn't keep going on, pretending that everything was fine, pretending that his actions hadn't hurt someone who didn't deserve it. The lawsuit against the police department was scheduled for a pretrial hearing, and Sierra knew it was going to be a long and hard-fought battle, but she wasn't backing down. Her resolve had only strengthened as the case gained national attention. She had been through so much in her career, but this felt different. This wasn't just about defending a client, it was about defending herself and defending the countless others who had been unjustly targeted because of the color of their skin. She spent hours preparing for the trial, meeting with her legal team, strategizing how to make her case heard loud and clear. They had already gathered evidence and witnesses who could attest to the systemic issues within the police force, and their investigation into Martinez's record showed a history of questionable conduct in previous stops. But Sierra knew that the fight would be much bigger than one officer's actions. It would be about addressing a broken system that needed to be reformed from the inside out. In the weeks leading up to the trial, Martinez couldn't stop thinking about what was coming next. The thought of facing Sierra in court made him uneasy, but he knew it was inevitable. The more he thought about it, the more he realized that no matter what happened in the courtroom, this was only the beginning. The world was watching now, and the case would have consequences that would stretch far beyond just the two of them. It was a fight for justice, a fight that Martinez had helped ignite, but one that he wasn't sure he was ready to face. The day of the Pretrial hearing arrived with an undeniable sense of anticipation. The courtroom was packed with reporters, activists, and members of the public who had followed the case closely. Sierra sat at the front with her legal team, composed and focused. Her face was calm, but her eyes were sharp. She knew that today wasn't just about her, it was about something far bigger. It was about sending a message that no one was above the law, not even those who swore to enforce it. The room buzzed with a low hum of conversation as people took their seats and the clock ticked down to the start of the hearing. Martinez sat in the back of the courtroom, trying to stay out of sight. He hadn't spoken to anyone since the case began, and he hadn't slept much in the past week. His mind kept replaying the same thoughts over and over again, wondering what would happen when the moment finally came when he had to face Sierra in court. He had always known that this job came with its challenges, but nothing had prepared him for the weight of what he was facing. Now the consequences of his actions had already started to shape his life, but the trial would be the ultimate test. The hearing began with the judge calling the court to order, and Sierra's legal team wasted no time. Presenting their case, they laid out the facts clearly and methodically, detailing how Martinez had profiled Sierra based on her appearance and wrongfully arrested her without probable cause. The evidence was damning. They had gathered witness statements from bystanders who had seen the entire encounter, and they had even found previous instances in which Martinez had acted in a similarly biased manner. But the most compelling part of the case was Sierra herself. She took the stand and spoke with unwavering confidence about the night of her arrest. She described the fear and frustration she had felt being treated as a criminal simply for existing in a neighborhood that wasn't meant for people like her. She spoke not just for herself, but for countless others who had been unjustly targeted by law enforcement because of the color of their skin. She described the trauma of being forced to explain her very presence in the world, as if it were something to be questioned, something to be feared. It was a powerful testimony that left many in the room in tears, and it was clear that her words had struck a chord with everyone present. Martinez sat quietly listening to Sierra's testimony, his hands clenched at his sides, as the weight of his mistake became even more evident. The guilt he had been carrying for weeks now felt like a crushing burden. As he listened to her describe the emotional and psychological toll of his actions, he realized just how much pain he had caused, how much damage he had done, not only to her, but to the larger fight for justice. The defense attempted to discredit Sierra's account, claiming that Martinez had acted in good faith, that he had simply been following standard procedure. But it was clear that the room wasn't buying it. The more the defense spoke, the more the public grew restless. They could see through the thinly veiled excuses, and they knew that this was a case that demanded real accountability. As the hearing drew to a close, Sierra's legal team presented their final argument with an impassioned plea for justice. They reminded the court that this case was not just about one officer's actions, but about the systemic issues that allowed such behavior to continue unchecked. It was about the need for police reform and the importance of holding law enforcement accountable for their actions. Martinez sat in silence as the judge adjourned the hearing for the day, but he knew that this wasn't over. It was just the beginning, and no matter the outcome of the trial, things would never be the same for him again.